So the first chapter is on Introduction to Texts That Argue, and we had a similar chapter earlier, which was Introduction to Texts That Inform. So whereas before we were looking at, that was talking about texts that what are called expository, or writing that is meant to inform, and you were doing assignments that were also informing, you're now transitioning to argument. So this chapter is focusing on those texts that argue. And what I say here is, hopefully things are sounding familiar at this point, because so what you've been doing is a lot of work to think about argument with, and for example, like with the rhetorical analysis assignment and the summary and strong response assignment. But you've been examining a lot of text and talking about the effectiveness of those texts and how they present arguments. And so the reason you've been doing these types of assignments are to prep you, kind of what I've been saying throughout the term, is they're to prep you to write your own texts that present an argument. So instead of reading and dissecting a text for its own effectiveness, you yourself are going to work on being effective in theory at delivering your own argument. So I, as usual, just kind of focus on some of the takeaways, and then I build on what Dively talks about when I see it as being applicable. And so I have a quotation here from her on page 285 that says, "Argument is an effective vehicle for exhibiting, developing, and assessing critical thinking skills. It is also an effective vehicle for expanding perspectives, advancing knowledge, and encouraging productive changes." And so then I kind of talk more about that. So because that first part of her quotation, this idea of assessing critical thinking skills, is argument, just like a lot of the other assignments that we do, an argumentative assignment is just another way for an instructor to assess your ability to be able to effectively craft an argument. So, and you see this all the time on standardized tests, so regardless of what the test is for, or even a certification test, if it's law school, if it's the MCAT to get into med school, if it's the GREs to get into graduate school, there's always a place in those tests where they want to assess your critical thinking skills, and this is always done through analytical and argumentative writing. So this chapter, in terms of what is the purpose of this chapter? So it works, Dively is working to explain, why is it that we write argument, and this is part of my consternation, is part of a problem that maybe I project this more than it actually is, but I have experienced this with student writers, is this idea of, well, why am I doing this assignment? And that's because I was always like that as a student. Anytime I've ever been given work, and even in my job still, I'm still like, why am I doing this? I need to understand the purpose and the objectives besides the purpose of just doing it. And so I'm always working to try to explain that for my students, because I think I have anxiety for my students based on my own anxieties of, why am I doing this? So, and so I kind of talk about, and Dively talks about these types of things too, that we write for lots of different reasons, whether you're writing for your work, if you're arguing for the effectiveness of a project or initiative, if you're arguing for more money, why you should get a promotion or a raise, or even everyday things where you should go to dinner that night with your friends. You're always making arguments in different conceptual spaces and discourse communities, and that's to refer back to an early chapter. So based on the discursive context in which you're positing an argument, that will inform how you make that argument, how you kind of go about it, which has to do with audience awareness. So Dively discusses some things that you want to pay close attention to when writing argumentatively, and she focuses on three main things. She focuses on tone, on structure, and then on logical fallacies. So and then I kind of intersperse what she talks with examples, and so I'm always trying to kind of supplement what she's doing. But when she talks about tone, This is this first bullet point I have. So when writing an argument paper, and anytime in academic writing, you want to be aware of the tone in which you use. And she gives the example of staying away from verbal attacks, which is really good advice, and I would say the same thing. I often refer to it as alienating language. You don't ever want to alienate your reader, and that's because even if you're writing to somebody that you have a problem with, or it's toward an organization or toward a movement that you have a problem with, you never want to alienate them. And so, but this is where I always say writing can be fun and potentially deceptive, is that the way we can use writing to get things for ourselves by effectively writing, you can be deceptive. So this is great because you can, the things I want to say I might want to verbally attack somebody, and I can still do that, but I can do that in a way where it doesn't look like verbal attacks. So if I'm able to manipulate my rhetoric in a way where I'm still attacking, but it doesn't come across that way, and I'm not losing my reader, then I've done a successful job of doing that. And I say here, right, if I just went ahead and said what I actually wanted to say in the argument, it wouldn't be effective, because it would probably just come off as a lot of verbal attacks. And, this is my argument and this is why I'm right, rather than couching it in a rhetorical way that, with tone does not make the reader want to stop reading, because that's your goal, is you want the reader to read through what you have to say. Even if they disagree with you, you don't want to lose your reader. And one of the ways you can lose them very quickly is through that alienating language and alienating tone and those verbal attacks. Diley doesn't use the term hedging. I am going to put this in here because hedging is a really important thing. So she does talk about this idea of, on page 279, the concept of the realm of the probable and what it means to stay within the realm of the probable. So, and what this means is it's making sure you're staying away from speaking in what we call absolute truths or universal statements. So when you make an argument in about 99% of situations, you aren't arguing for a universal or an absolute truth, and that's mostly because truth is unknown, right? There's no answer to these things for which you're arguing. So you need to stay within the realm of the probable. And I have kind of a long example here, but this is something that I got from a professor of mine many years ago, but it really stuck with me. So I tend to use it and bring it up when relevant. But it's this metaphor of chipping away at an iceberg as the act of argumentative writing, so that when we write argumentation, we are metaphorically chipping away at that iceberg to get to a supposed truth, but that truth is also imaginary, and this imaginary truth is at the center of the iceberg, and we're trying to slowly chip away at the iceberg by arguing in order to get to the center. However, if we were to ever get to the center, there would be nothing there, because we make our own truths and our own meaning making, and this concept of truth is something that we construct. So, and I also then give the example of the legal system, because that's something I'm interested in my own research, but the entire legal system is based on this premise of the metaphor of the iceberg. So, and I give the example, or what are definitions of pornography or obscenity? So the government has had to sit down and figure this out, right? What does pornography mean? What does it look like? How do we constitute these different ratings? So when something's given like an MA rating, what does that mean? So there's no truth in this act. So when we look at, say, this is what the government definition of pornography is, or this is the government definition of obscenity, there's no truth in it besides the constructed truth that the government imposes on it to create a sense of order. So they make arguments, right, but they're still not, these definitions, these federal government definitions of pornography and obscenity are not universal truths, right? It's not like something like gravity. So we know what gravity is, we call it, we know that this concept exists, we just happen to call it gravity. So but I know that if I were to like move my computer off the desk, I would presume that it would fall to the ground because that is a universal truth. And then I can kind of continue this conversation of hedging. So when you hedge, there are times to hedge and times not to hedge. And I say, and when we say the word hedge, like what does it mean to actually hedge? You are using words like arguable, probable, likely, perhaps. It's how you rhetorically get out of the realm of absolute truth and into the realm of the probable, which is what Dively calls it. And then I give an example as to what that looks like. So I just have two statements here. So that first one is a universal statement, which also contains flawed logic. So it also contains a logical fallacy. And so the statement is video games that contain shooting lead to more deaths by shooting. So this is posited as a universal statement, but it's actually not. So this is a statement that needs evidence and qualification. When you want to get out of that realm and into the realm of the probable, that needs revision. So, and here it's video games that contain shooting arguably lead to more deaths by, deaths by shooting. So just dropping in that hedge word arguably immediately takes you out of the realm of absolute truth. So here I steered clear of a universal statement, even though I would still need to follow this up with evidence that supports that idea. One thing that Dively doesn't mention, but I want to bring up, is this concept of formal tone. And it's what we call American academic English. We always want to be writing in a formal academic tone. This does not mean using big, multi-syllabic words. It just means being concise, precise. In particular, things like staying away from colloquialisms, jargon, contractions, idiomatic language, and then these are kind of the acts of American academic English, right? Demonstrating knowledge, critical thinking, executing analysis in an adept way, and integrating sources with acumen. So doing that doing all of that in a tone that is formal and academic is what you want to do. So idiomatic language is probably the most problematic because people will write in idiomatic language and not be aware of it because they tend to be phrases that we use a lot in our everyday lives. And so unless you have become really clued into these are the idiomatic phrases that I tend to use more in my own writing, which is again another thing that you want to do is always paying attention to how you are as a writer until you become familiar with that, and it takes time, but idiomatic language is one of those kind of more obscure ones where it happens a lot in writing, but you have to know what to look for in order to revise it so that it's not idiomatic. Okay, so that's tone. She then moves on to structure, and she focuses this on, so structure is what's called methodology or organization. So this is the way you go about presenting information in your writing, and she focuses on what's called the Toulmin's taxonomy, and this is on page 280. And this here is Toulmin's taxonomy, right? So he goes through claim, data, warrant, backing, qualifier, and point of rebuttal. And this again should sound familiar. It's not very different from what you'll be doing what you do in a classical argument paper, or what she calls a position paper. So, right, the claim is the thesis, the data is your subclaims and supporting points for your own thesis. The warrant, which is one of the more difficult things that students have to do, but it's really important, is why your claim is warranted. That is, why should anyone give 2 seconds of their time to reading about what it is you're arguing? And then she talks about this in more detail in chapter 19. The backing is the further evidence that you bring into your paper to justify that your claim is warranted. The qualifier is basically your analysis, right? So you're bringing in all this evidence, you're making all of these points in order to support a claim. So then you have to do the analysis, right, which is demonstrating how your backing not only helps support the data in that paragraph, but also your overall claim. And then the point of rebuttal. right? So this is where you bring in the opposition or the counter argument, and then you rebuttal that or you refute that. So, and that always makes for increased ethos on your behalf as the writer, because it shows that you have an understanding of the multiple perspectives of a particular topic, and you're able to rebut or refute the opposition or counter argument with efficacy. And I say that, she doesn't say this obviously because because she doesn't know about your outline activity for this week, but one of the things that Toulmin's taxonomy is helpful for is because it's your outline activity for this week is implicitly kind of connected to Toulmin's taxonomy. So these different points that are identified in this taxonomy are very similar to the different steps you'll be doing in the outline activity. And she has a matrix for the taxonomy and then an example of each taxonomic element. And so there's tone structure, and then she ends with logical fallacies. And this starts on page 284. I'm not going to discuss these at length because really what it is she identifies all of these different logical fallacies and explains what they mean. But logical fallacies are flawed logic. So it's someone who's trying to make an argument, but there's clear what we call argumentative fallaciousness, or it's a fallacious argument, which means that there's a flaw in the logic. And then she has another matrix for the fallacy. So this is relevant to the blog assignment for the particular week. Okay, so then going into chapter 19 is where she talks about the position paper. And one thing she talks about, I actually disagree with her about this, but she kind of makes this argument that, we have all these different terms for research papers, including the term research paper, but there's, these ideas of the term paper, the research paper, the position paper, the classical argument paper. And she says, well, position paper is actually this large umbrella genre where these other argumentative genres fall under. So I personally don't agree with her. I'd actually never heard the word position paper until I read her textbook when I started teaching this class. But so that's kind of what she starts with, is just kind of justifying, like, why do I call this chapter position paper? And you're reading this chapter because you have the upcoming classical argument paper, which according to Dively is a position paper. So that's how this chapter is relevant. So she gives a definition of it, right, which is the goal of the position paper is to carve out your own position in the midst of this complexity. So when she talks about complexity, she means whatever controversy with which you are addressing in some way for your paper. And you can improve your ability to argue a firm stance on this and other issues that provoke an intense reaction from you by recognizing the conventions of position papers. And that goes back to that idea of recursivity, that through examining other texts and how they make arguments and coming to conclusions about whether or not the way they go about arguing is effective or ineffective, you yourself can become a more effective writer and arguer, because you understand the conventions and you have an understanding of what we call the best practices. So these are effective practices versus ineffective practices. And I say the below quotation is an extension of her conversation on structure from chapter 16. So she kind of goes through, this is what a position paper looks like, and gives some different steps to it, right? So she says I took out the part about the hook because I personally don't like the hook. You can have a hook if you want. I just don't agree with it. It's actually a divisive topic in writing. So a lot of writing instructors encourage their students to write hooks. I encourage my students to get right to the point. So position papers first provide an overview of the controversy, which makes clear that the issue is indeed debatable. Very important to do. So in most cases, the author demonstrates debatability by briefly representing differing positions, and doing so educates readers about various stances that have already been articulated, and doing this also strengthens your ethos or credibility by demonstrating, and this should sound familiar, that you fully understand the nuances of the debate, right? You've done your research and you have the credibility to talk about something. So that quotation goes into the idea of carving a space for your own argument, which is difficult to do rhetorically. It's not easy, so students struggle with it, but it is something that you have to do in writing. And I try to give an example of what that looks like, and I just used that video games kind of thesis statement that I had before. I did take the one that has the hedging in it. So I said, right, if that's your thesis, I would anticipate work in your introduction that leads into that thesis, that prepares the reader for that thesis. So in order to rhetorically do the work that needs to be done in the intro, like a lot of stuff has to get done to prep the reader for that thesis. And because what's common in student writers' introductions is that by the time they get to their thesis, they've addressed nothing that helps the reader understand what is all the stuff you're giving me in your introduction and how is it leading me up to this thesis. Like there's a disconnect between the introduction's content and the introduction's thesis. So if that is your thesis, right, if we're imagining this one about video games, some things that I would anticipate, I would expect to be in the introduction is that you, the writer, would have to identify that there is an actual debatable issue or controversy that exists between video games with shooting and death by shooting. Like you just can't say something, or you have to be a very established person to just say something. So we're not in that realm. So first you have to identify that there's an actual debatable issue. And how do you do that? You do that through bringing in evidence, right? If you want to say that this issue actually exists, then you need to bring in evidence from best practices, both sides, right? You have to give evidence from the side that says, right, video games that are more violent lead to more violent behavior and culture, versus the people who say violent video games do not lead to more violent behavior and culture. And so identifying those two sides of the situation is needed to be done in the introduction because it would be leading into your thesis. And right, it just can't be you saying, yeah, more video games that have shooting lead to more deaths by shooting. Like that is not enough. You have to bring in evidence to help demonstrate that this issue actually exists. And then including evidence, this is kind of like what I just said, including evidence in the introduction to further strengthen the notion that the controversy you've chosen is in fact debatable. And just like I said before, it usually comes in the form of having both sides of the argument. And the more evidence offered, I'm always hesitant on giving this type of information, but the more evidence offered in the intro usually strengthens the writer's ethos. And I don't want people to take that the wrong way, because you don't want an introduction that's just a bunch of quotations, right? You need to cleverly and meaningfully integrate clearly chosen quotations, usually brief, that help carve that space that you need to carve in the introductions. So you need an intro that has brief quotations that clearly provide corroboration for points you are making as the writer. And all of that should then lead up to whatever particular thesis you have. You don't want that disconnect between all of the content in your introduction and the thesis statement. So those are the 2 chapters for this particular week. I'm going to go back to modules and look at the outline activity really briefly. I feel like there's steps to it, and so when you first look at it, it can look a little bit overwhelming, but each day, starting on the 3rd day, on Wednesday, you essentially have to go in here and do some work on a particular thing, right? So for the first day, you're working on formulating a claim and reasons. And then the day after that, providing data and evidence. And then after that, examining an unstated assumption, and then identifying an objection and rebuttal, and then using ethos, pathos, and logos. So, and then the post is due on the last day of the module week. I don't understand what third post. I mean, I just saw that and I was like, that doesn't make sense. So I'm going to actually modify that. I don't write these, but this should say 4th and 5th. So I'll modify those so it makes a little bit more sense. And then you want to look at each of these documents, which are meant to help you. We open it up. Just take a look at the first one. And it's going to give you some information and kind of some prompts to help you get started each day that you do this. And it's also asking you to do it in different days, because in theory you could do this all in one day, but that's not, in theory, I'm saying that a lot, that's not the most productive way to do it. And that's because this is emphasizing that concept of doing some work toward writing and then stepping away from it and then coming back to it and adding to it and then stepping away and then going back to it, right? So it's emphasizing that concept of recursivity and reflective revision, which is what we want. So you really want to try to stay with the steps that they have here and doing it on the recommended days that they have.